Tale Podcast: How Stories Shape and Change Our Lives. All myths and fairy tales carry within them archetypal themes. And if we remember back to the first episode, as we were defining what the archetype is a symbol that is universal, an idea that can't be reduced any further than what it already is. If we remember, the example I gave in the first episode was the archetype of mother, and how mother is an idea or a symbol that is universal across all cultures, across all peoples, across the entire earth. And out of that, we get this idea of what in mythology gets called the divine or eternal archetype of the feminine, as well as the divine archetype of the masculine. And it's important to understand, particularly when we are speaking the language of myth, that we are not speaking of literal things. We're speaking in symbols and in metaphors. And these symbols and metaphors remind us that they are referring to deep and abiding energies within us. So, for instance, when we talk about divine feminine energy and divine masculine energy, we're not talking in terms of sex or gender. We're talking in terms of energies that have the potential to be awakened in each and every human being, and energies that represent a feeling of opposites. And we've talked about the tension of opposites before, and the importance of learning how to balance those tensions and the creativity that can come out of balancing those tensions. Over these next 3 episodes, I'll be in conversation with my very good friend, Dr. Amy Ferrell, as we together make our foray into exploring some of the mysteries of these archetypes of the divine feminine and divine masculine energies, and also talking about them in the backdrop of our modern day ideas and words and thinking, and reckoning with those things in terms of looking at the patriarchy, and in terms of looking at both externalized and internalized misogyny, and how those ideas impact our thinking about these divine universal principles. I'm excited to have you join us along on this journey over these next 3 episodes. We're going to talk about some interesting stuff. So without further ado, here's my conversation with my good friend, Dr. Amy Ferrell. Hello, Amy.
Hello.
And welcome.
Thank you.
We get to talk about some fun stuff today. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, me too.
Yes. Just for our guests that are listening, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do?
Yes. So I am faculty in the School of Education and Human Development at CU Denver. And I did my PhD work at CU Boulder. I study issues related to discourse and literacy and reading comprehension for students with disabilities. But also I'm interested in issues of community as perhaps like another paradigm to think about what we usually call inclusion.
Yes.
Because inclusion is essentially, like in the world of education, kind of our word as special educators. Like we've been talking about inclusion basically since the inception of special education.
Yeah.
And so we're basically on a hamster wheel. So, for the decades since we've been talking about it.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if perhaps that term is a bit too steeped in a binary of in and out. And what could it mean if, of course, everybody's in, right? Because by nature of humanity, you're in. What could it mean for people, for students to have a sense of belonging and being feeling valued and mattering in the wholeness of who they are.
Yeah.
within an idea of community
Mhm.
where it means, mutual obligation to the other and
Right.
reciprocity
Mhm.
um and essentially like that paradigm
Yeah.
of egalitarian reciprocity is going to buck like the oppressive systems, or it's going to challenge them,
Right.
which of
As it
course
should.
institutions, yeah, as it should.
Mhm.
And, of course, institutions of education are
Yeah.
very much situated within societal
Right.
power imbalances and reproduce them. Um, I mean, we're basically it's a commodification
Yeah.
uh, enterprise
Right.
where we commodify achievement and learning and ability, and we structure these values according to who learns well.
Right.
And, it doesn't take long for kids to realize as soon as they enter the education system who's valued and who's not.
Right.
So yeah, so it kind of ties with the
Well,
wholeness that you and I have
yeah.
talked about.
Well,
Um,
and I think from what you just described about what you're doing, you bring a unique perspective to the conversation that we're about to have today,
yes.
which is important. And I'm excited to talk about it because I think everything that you just said has something to bear on the stories that we tell about ourselves as individual human beings. And as
Yes.
we begin to discover and name what the different parts of our humanness are or how we understand them, right?
Right.
And so, two of those big principles that we're going to talk about are the concept of the divine feminine and the divine masculine, and what we think each of those things actually is, right?
Love it. Yes.
Well, I listen to myself talk enough on this podcast. So if you're okay with that, I'd like to let you start us off with some of your initial thoughts, wherever you want to jump in.
Okay. Okay, sure. I mean, there's a
Right?
lot here.
Yes, there is.
So so
And we'll
yes, so
just
you
we'll
jump
just
in whenever.
go through it as it comes. And if we have to create like three or four different episodes, then that's what we'll do. So
Fabulous. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think maybe I'll start with a memory I have of myself
yeah.
probably about 7.5 years ago.
Mhm.
Actually, it would have been 7.5 or 8 years ago.
Okay.
Sitting in church at the church that I attended at the time.
Right.
And this is essentially before my own sort of personal spiritual awakening
Right.
and devastation and everything that
Sure.
comes with an awakening. But I remember sitting in church thinking, I wish I knew God as feminine
Right.
because then she would get me.
Ah, yeah.
And it was almost like that sort of thought or wish or desire or dream
Right.
was an invocation
Yeah. Ah, yeah.
because it was quite literally months later that my world exploded.
Yeah.
And in that explosion and the process of navigating it and figuring out, like making order out of the chaos,
Mhm.
I found the divine feminine, and
Yeah.
she did come to me
Wow.
and made herself very, very, very apparent
Wow.
um, to me. And at the time, just given the circumstances of where I am and my social circle um and my who I was around at the time,
Hey,
the uh La Virgen, uh
yeah.
the Our Lady of Guadalupe,
Our Lady of
uh,
Guadalupe. Yeah.
is specifically kind of the image and the being of the
Mm.
divine feminine, was who I felt quite a strong connection to and had quite
Yeah.
amazing experiences with during that time.
And it sounds like that's an image that just sort of showed up for you somehow.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I was introduced to her for sure. But the way that sort of the imagery and even just kind of these mystical experiences that I had
Right.
um, at the time directly related to her
Wow.
um, just started happening.
Hmm.
Uh, so so she was a kind of an anchor for me of
Yeah.
like, oh, like they're okay. This is this is a thing. Like I can find divinity in
Right.
and with her it's kind of motherhood.
Motherhood.
Um
Okay. Hmm.
and I would characterize what I was going through at the time as my rebirth.
Oh, yeah.
And so those themes of birth
Yeah.
and new life and transformation
Right.
um, really were symbolized by kind of a divine mother figure.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the circle of life and death and rebirth.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And of course, from my upbringing, from our upbringing,
Hmm. Right.
we did not exactly revere Mother Mary. She was
No.
very she was very human in our human divine kind of binary dichotomy. She was definitely still very human. And
Hmm.
there was nothing sort of supernatural or extraordinary other than the virgin birth.
She was
Um,
a little more than an afterthought for me in terms of how often we talked about her, which was almost nothing.
yeah, just at Christmas.
Yes, right. Good
Right.
job at giving birth to our Lord and Savior Jesus
Lord
Christ.
and Savior.
Now move along.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So kind of entering to more of a of reverence and a divine figure that saw the creation of life
Right, right,
that the feminine body provides
right.
uh, was an entry point into me as I was making sense of my own like material
Yeah.
new life that was happening. Like it wasn't just some sort of idea or belief or thought or like dogma or something that
Yeah,
just magically happens when you say the magic prayer. It
right.
was like, no, there's actually this real transformation that's happening in my life, in my everyday, but also within me and how I see myself.
The material that draws me to the humus, the ground, the earth. That's what I think of.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And the material being, and I don't quite know the etymology and how these words sort of
Mhm.
mean the same thing, but matter and
Yeah,
material, then like the Latin mater,
yeah,
mater,
yeah.
right? Like those are
That's
the
pretty
mother and the
obvious when you look
it's
at
pretty
it.
obvious,
Yeah,
right? The mother is the material.
right,
It's the everything around us. It's our breath. It's what we can feel, what we can touch, what we can say.
right.
Like, what's tangible rather than what's sort of just in the ether or abstract or just in like kind of the ideas.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. Um, to find spirit in the earth as though they are one and the same, essentially, right? They're not these separated entities that are in tension with each other or duking it out with each other.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah, one necessitates the other.
exactly. Yeah.
And they're mutually constituting. And that's, yeah, and that piece of the integration of opposites
Uh-huh.
was a huge part of
Yeah,
my awakening and my transformation and that experience,
that's pretty archetypal right there. That well,
right?
the necessary archetypal thing that must happen for that kind of
Exactly.
experience. Yeah.
Right, right. And so that was sort of another way that I think the divine feminine was like showing
Yeah.
me. Like I have some pretty strong memories of um, just different symbols that were coming to me at the time of my, awakening. Um, where one was navigating a dark forest.
A dark forest. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so whatever, like you might know more than I do about like what the dark
I'm not
forest.
interested in what I think I know. You keep going. Dark forest.
But like the dark forest and just making your way through this, like you can't see anything and you don't know what's out there and it's scary, but um but it seemed like there were these little luminaries along the path. And
Hmm.
those luminaries were all the kind of the what I saw is like the magical, mystical experiences, the
Yeah, tell me more
synchronicity.
about that. What is the magical mystical experience? What connection do you make with those words?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, there were synchronicities of things that just felt like,
Hmm.
come on, this can't be a coincidence, or just like some sort of like
Right.
just happened to
Right.
happen. Like um it felt, and maybe I needed it to feel, but it
Hmm.
felt bigger than me and bigger than just
Yeah.
um than just kind of an everyday experience. It felt like there was something that I didn't quite understand
Right.
logically
Hmm.
or from a common sense perspective or intellectually of
For your attention first and foremost, and then you had to make a decision to pay attention.
yes,
And that's the alchemy, it seems, or part of the alchemy,
yes,
the mystical
yes,
experience. Yeah.
right. And so whether it was like a dream that came true the next day, or
Right.
whether it was kind of these visions or voices
Hmm.
that I
Yeah.
was starting to then sort of pay attention to. So speaking of a voice and speaking of Our Lady of Guadalupe, one of those, mystical experiences happened when I was on a walk.
Yeah.
And at the time, I would walk this creek path
Yeah.
kind of downtown where I live.
Mhm.
And and I walked, and this is a path I would walk like almost every day, right?
Yeah.
Out and back.
Mhm.
And I walked past this area where kind of the trees by the sidewalk opened just a little bit.
Mhm.
And you could see kind of just how there was a bit of an opening and kind of this kind of landing place by the bank of the creek.
Okay.
And it looked just kind of inviting and nice and whatever, but I was on a schedule um and as I passed it, I heard, go down there, Guadalupe's there.
Hmm.
And
Wow.
I was like, that's weird. Like,
Yeah.
okay,
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. And so I I said no to
Uh-huh.
that.
Right.
I said, I'm actually not going to.
Yeah.
And that was big for me at the time because any sort of thing that I would imagine to be divine
Um,
or sort of the supernatural or of something that's godlike, any sort of voice that I might hear, I was not socialized to say no.
of course.
I
Yes.
was socialized to comply, to obey. There's something outside of you that tells you what to do,
Right.
and then you have to do it. And in fact, I had to be really careful that I didn't interpret synchronicities and mis
Oh, yeah.
experiences as something out there telling me what I needed to do.
Like a divine imperative or an order of some kind.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, commanding,
Yeah.
or even if it was a loving,
Right.
guide
Yeah.
telling you what to do, I had to learn to have the agency to say, I get to decide too.
Wow.
And that this is a relationship, that
Yes.
this experience, if whatever sort of spiritual cosmic orchestration might be working with my own, you
Right.
know, agency
Mhm.
or unconsciousness or whatever, I get to be able to
Yeah.
call the shots
Right.
here with what
Yeah.
happens to
You
me.
hold on to you hold on to your agency. You recognize that as sacred,
Yeah.
important. You can't have a relationship with something other than yourself unless you yourself are capable of showing up.
Right.
You
Right.
know.
And it was a way for me to also just take responsibility for my
Ah,
choices,
exactly. Yes.
right? Without just being in complete deference all the time.
Right. That's a
Because
that's a good word and an important one. Hmm.
that was our theology is deference, his will over yours.
Right.
Like
Right.
you submit to God's will. And we were always trying to figure out what that is, you know,
Hmm.
like and listen for the guidance from out there.
Right. And careful not to make a mistake because
Right.
that would be bad somehow.
Right. Right. and willful, you don't want to be willfully disobedient because that's what sin is.
Right.
And so when you live that way, constantly in deference to something outside of you, you don't learn to take responsibility for yourself.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
It's all within the framework that's
Mhm.
already been set for you.
Right.
Like
So you
you
don't have
don't
to
say,
think about it.
yeah, yeah, you don't call the shots, ultimately in like the divine, because God calls the shots.
Right.
And so it's always just kind of like trying to figure out what God wants, but then
Yeah.
basically by doing that, you put all the responsibility onto God
Hmm.
for yourself, and it's this misplaced responsibility,
Yeah. Yeah.
which that's a whole other thing I
Well,
could go into,
and
but
we'll get you, yeah, something that we'll be getting into at some point, obviously.
yeah.
And I can see how
But
this ties up with that. Yeah.
so back to the story of the walk by the creek. Um, so I had said no, and I had decided, you know what? Actually, not right now. Maybe on another walk, or maybe even just on the way back if I feel compelled. But in that moment, I
Hmm.
said no. And I walked to kind of the point, the outermost point,
Right.
turned back around, and curiosity got the best of me because
Oh,
because the voice, or the sensation was quite clear, and it seemed quite convincing. Um, and so I just thought, you know what, I'll just go down there. It seemed like a nice shady spot. Like it was this lovely, I'll go down, I'll touch the water because water's had such meaning for me.
yes.
Um, like
Mhm.
any bodies of water, but water has such deep symbolism for me. I
Absolutely.
thought, you know what? I'll put my hands on the water
Yeah.
and I'll do a little ritual, do a little prayer,
Hmm.
let the water wash away any fear or jealousy or sadness or, whatever.
Right.
And so I did. So I just kind of sat there on the bank of the creek and just rested for a bit. And then I look up, and it was May, so the water was pretty high because of the snow melt coming down from the mountains. And so the distance across the creek was actually quite far, you know.
Right.
And and I look up, but I see this circle of flowers on the other side.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
there was a picture in the middle of the circle of flowers. And I couldn't quite make out what it was just by looking at it. I had a really old phone at the time and the camera was horrible.
Yeah.
So
Right.
like zooming in to try and
Yeah.
like see it, it was not
Yeah.
helping.
Yeah.
Um, so I was like, darn it, I guess I just won't know what
Hmm.
that is. So I left and I went back home. But the next day I was like, dang it, I really want to know what's over
Yeah.
there.
Your
I
curiosity
really,
is really working on you now.
it's really working on me. Yeah. So I decided I'd figure out a way to get there. So I made my way to the next like bridge over the creek, and and basically so I crossed the bridge, but then I had to like hop a fence, and then I had to
Right.
go through
So there was no
bramble.
easy path there. You had to finagle your way
I did finagle, yeah,
over
and it
there.
was like it's kind of a steep hill with a lot of bramble and bushes,
Uh-huh.
and I just like you feel like you're in the jungle kind of. So like it's scratched and thorns and everything. No, like quite symbolic actually. So
It's very much so. Yeah.
I'm like going through to find this circle of flowers. And so finally I see it and I get there and it's some plastic or some artificial flowers. And I see that it's a baby memorial. And sure enough, the image in the middle is Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Yes. Hmm. So
So
Guadalupe was down there
she was there. She was there.
next to
Yeah.
the water, through the forest, through the wilderness, into the hummus or the humus.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes. And the sort of the dichotomy or the juxtaposition of the new life and
Yeah.
death,
Right. All there.
all there. all sort of encompassing my story and what I was experiencing at the time.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so
Wow.
those types of symbols and
It
those
takes your
types,
breath away when you kind of think about a moment like that a little bit, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right. And so in terms of and back to the word material, maybe this will come up a whole lot because like this is to me
Absolutely.
part of the essence of the divine feminine.
Right.
Um, is like it it was there. Like, yes, it was like a voice in my head
Mhm.
or, in my unconscious or wherever.
Sure.
Like there was the idea, there was the voice, there was kind of
Yep.
the nice sort of like spiritual, oh, God is everywhere, divine is
Right.
everywhere,
Yeah.
whatever. Yes. And
Mhm.
like I was able to touch this manifestation or this representation
Yeah.
of her and see it and know that was
Mhm.
a representation of somebody's life also just completely torn apart.
Of course. Yeah. Right. But it all goes back into the soil somehow.
Right. Right. And there's an eternity in that.
Yeah. Well, and I can't help but, the time of year that this happened for you, May, right?
Right.
Right in the middle of spring.
Right.
Significant somehow.
Right. The month we celebrate Mother's Day.
Hmm.
Yeah. Right.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Right. Right.
So you you established your agency first. Once the invitation was offered, you established your own agency, and you recognize that that's important, and that your ability to make a choice is important. And then it seems like after that, after you showed yourself that you could do that, it felt okay to receive it. What it kind of sounds like what it was in the first place was not a command, but an invitation.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
An invitation to which I could decline.
Right. Hmm. Yeah.
Right. And perhaps and there, perhaps if I had chosen to just not go down there, perhaps it would have been because I just wasn't ready
Sure.
for that invitation or
Right.
ready to walk through that door.
Hmm.
And it wouldn't mean that the invitation or that sort of invitation for that experience wouldn't come in some other way or down
Right.
the road or, be adjusted somehow.
Hmm.
But it's that reciprocity and that mutuality
Hmm.
is how
Yeah.
I interpret that
Well,
experience.
that's so central to the theme of my understanding of the divine feminine itself, what you
Right,
just said there.
right,
Yeah.
right. That
Mhm.
it's a co-construction.
Yeah.
There's it, it- there's kind of a transitory
Yeah.
like mutability
Mhm.
in what happens because we have agency to say I'm ready or I'm not.
Right.
And
Right.
even if it's conscious or not, like sometimes we're just not ready for certain realities to be made known to us.
Well, and we are all whole human beings with all of those things, even if we're just mostly operating out of our own ego consciousnesses while we're
Right.
during the day and just kind of making our way through things. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's, another thing about what you're talking about, whether it's an invitation or a synchronicity, something that catches your attention and asks you to pay attention is that you have to slow down. You have to
Right.
you have to slow down what you're doing
Right.
to be able to catch it, to be able to see it, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so there's the slow energy element that comes that seems really, really important to be able to know how to get into and to know how to practice to some degree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it could be in kind of like learning how to meditate, learning
Hmm.
how to be still,
Right.
learning how to be alone, like all of
Yeah.
those sorts of spiritual practices that are common, but it's also just a different way to move throughout your day and throughout your world. Is
Yes.
to kind of be willing to see and to hear and to feel and to know,
Ex-
and to attend to it. And sometimes sometimes those things that feel like gut knowing, sometimes you're spot on and sometimes you're not.
Right.
And so that slow energy or that slow sort of experience, once you learn to kind of attend to your body and
Yeah.
attend to the information you're getting,
Right.
um, you can
Yeah.
start to learn and differentiate.
And it's interesting too how the ground, the humus, the earth necessitates that's where you go, So as rereading earlier this morning some of my Marie-Louise von Franz interpretation of fairy tales, and one of the stories that she's telling in there about three sons of a king who are looking for partners, right? Um, and the one they call Dumbling, which sounds awful, but there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah.
Is the only one that follows the animals and that follows. In some versions, it starts out as a frog. In other versions, it just turns into a frog. But frogs, reptiles, amphibians, snakes, those kinds of creatures are very archetypal, thematic elements of the divine feminine in fairy tales, or in Jungian language, the anima, which is sort of the object of divinity, or for, for men in that particular, you know, way of looking at things. Um, but it's always going down into the earth somehow.
Yes.
And the creatures that inhabit those realms of earth and water.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's um and to me, another aspect of the divine feminine is that like internal world.
That's,
It's the it's
yeah.
the world that's in the dark. It's
Mhm.
the world that's unseen or unknown.
Right.
And and so of course, like underground, underwater,
Yep.
um, would be archetypal symbols of that unknown and of the unconscious, even.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and then that's where we, let's relate it back to the matter, or the material. That's where do we plant seeds for new growth? In the ground.
In the
It's
ground.
in the ground, in the dark, right?
Right,
And they have to be there for a while.
right, right. They're
Mhm.
gonna gestate.
Exactly.
They're gonna it's gonna be the slow energy. It's gonna be the
Right.
moving. It's gonna
Yeah.
be sort of out of your awareness or out of what's seen.
Right.
And and to me that there's also an element of like death that comes into the realm of the
Necessarily
unknown.
so. Necessarily so. That is exactly what is supposed to happen in the shadow realm, is death.
Yes.
We're carrying where it, and it's interesting. I was just having a conversation with my good friend Bear yesterday, which is going to be presented in another podcast episode, which is cool, and I'm excited
Right.
about it. And he was talking about the medicine wheel and the Western direction. He was saying I always start out in the West because the West is where the darkness is, and that's where uh, Bear heads towards the West to go hibernate each year.
Yeah. Right.
And that's where you receive your instruction, which is this is what you're carrying around. So you see it,
Mm.
right? And so
Mhm.
you get your work is one way to put it, right?
Mhm.
From the West, from the shadow, right? If you have no ability to look into the dark or to look into the shadow, you really have no ability to know anything about yourself
Right.
at all.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so that the um, part of my awakening too, in addition to the dark forest sort of
Yeah.
imagery,
Yeah.
was another one was a sinking ship.
A sinking ship.
Being on a sinking ship,
Mhm.
middle of the ocean. And I called her my Leviathan.
The
Was
ocean or the sinking ship?
sorry, I'm introducing a new character.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Fair enough. Go ahead.
So, starting the stage on a sinking ship in the middle of the ocean, and then my Leviathan, this sea monster, this
Hmm.
dragon, this terrifying eel, octopus,
Hmm.
ugly,
Yeah.
like monster, totally scary.
Eldritch
Um,
horror.
what's that?
Eldritch horror almost. Yeah.
Yeah, the Kraken.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
what made her way like up to kind of my eye level,
Mhm.
where I had to look her in the face
Wow.
and know that she was me.
Interesting.
That this shadow element of myself,
Hmm.
this sort of capacity for destruction,
Right.
this capacity for sort of this all this pent up kind of emotion and energy and passion and anger and
Yeah.
need for agency,
Yeah.
um, need for a sense of control, um, was coming up to say, "I'm here.
I'm here.
I'm here. You
Wow.
called." Because for 40 years, essentially, I had
Mhm.
shoved her down.
Yeah.
No, you're not supposed to be powerful.
Right.
No, you're not supposed to feel this. Like all the ways that I had rejected that part of me, rejected the fact that I had needs and it was okay for me to state them, that I
Hmm.
didn't need to defer to everyone else, that
Right.
I could claim my own sense of here's what I want
Yeah.
and here's what I need, which was something that I just, and women aren't socialized to do this. And
Right.
given our
Yeah.
theology and patriarchy and all of that, like that was an element of me that I had crushed down. But now suddenly here
Yeah.
she was looking me in the face
Right.
saying, I am you. And I had to learn to then like show compassion to her.
Right. Find a place for her to exist.
Yes, to listen to her,
Yeah.
to like let her have a turn to speak
Hmm.
after years of trying to
Yeah.
spear her and reject her and fight her off and to slay the dragon.
Right. Yeah.
Right? That's the binary,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
the
and that's our Western mythological inheritance, unfortunately, when it comes to that kind of dragon imagery.
right, right. And so the transformation was me. I mean, just the mere fact that she was me. It's like, what? Like there
Yeah.
was a time I remember sitting in therapy and talking about what was going on in my world and I said, Kim, this isn't me. This just isn't me. And she leaned forward, she looked me dead in the eye, and she said, this is you. You're
Hmm.
living it. You're experiencing it. This is you. So, like,
And what a validating moment, by the way,
I,
to be seen accurately, that
yeah,
part of you especially by somebody else. It's that in and of itself is an initiation.
yes. And at first it hurt my feelings.
Yeah, right.
Like, no,
Yeah,
it's not. I'm not a
yeah,
bad person.
yeah. It wasn't in accord with your ego ideal at the time, and so you felt the hurt of it.
Exactly.
Of course.
Exactly. Because my ego ideal was I'm a good person. I don't hurt anybody and I don't cause any destruction and I don't do anything bad.
Right. Yes.
And my Leviathan was there to say, "Hey, you are whole."
Right. You are whole. So with that, because we got less than a minute here, are you interested in doing a part two?
Yes, yes. I
Okay.
have other things. I have other things.
There's more to say,
Yeah,
and
there's so much more to say.
we want to create room to say them. So I'm going to wrap this one up, and we'll get another one going here real quick.
Okay.
And just, I want to thank you so much for coming on here. My very good friend Amy, we have so much more to talk about. And
Yes.
learning as we get into other topics, as people learn about our mutual shared heritage. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in for this wonderful conversation between myself and my good friend, Dr. Amy Ferrell. Please stay tuned. We have 2 more wonderful, enticing, interesting episodes to go. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to having you all come along. Thanks again, and as always, take good care of yourselves.